Hey guys, welcome to Ben Wrenchin. My name's Ben, and today I'm wrenching on this 2011 Subaru Forester. I'm going to be replacing the radiator today, and I'll show you what the problem is with this one. I just did the rear brakes. I'll link that video in the description, and I'm also going to be doing the front driver's side CV axle, but I'll knock that out after I get the radiator done. So let me show you what the problem is. The hood release handle is right under here. Push this lever over and then lift up. This is the lever right here. You just push this over and pull up. I'm still not used to foreign cars, but here's the radiator right here. And there's a pretty good leak on this one. So you can see some coolant right there, quite a bit more over here. So it looks like it was coming from this hose, but as I looked at it, I noticed there's a pretty big crack underneath the upper radiator hose and the plastic on the top of this radiator. And it was leaking pretty bad. So I'm gonna go ahead and change out the radiator. I'll show you that crack once I get this out. And it really doesn't look too bad to get out. We've got this air intake and that'll pop off. A couple hoses, some electrical connectors to the fans, nothing too bad. So we'll go ahead and get into it. The first thing I'm going to do is drain the coolant. There's my new radiator and some coolant. I'm also going to do the Serpentine Belt in this video. The quote from a shop on the radiator and coolant flush was $692, and the Serpentine Belt is $192. I got a new radiator for 75 bucks on Amazon. I'll link that in the description. A couple of jugs of coolant and a new Serpentine belt for 15 bucks. So almost less than $100, which is a lot cheaper than what the shop was quoting. And this should be pretty easy to do. So let's get into it. So looking at the new radiator, we've just got the upper hose intake and the lower hose, and then a couple of connections here on the bottom. So that's really all we have to disconnect. There's also the coolant overflow reservoir up in this area. So we'll take that off the old one, put it on the new one. And looking at where the lower radiator hose is, it's going to be down there at the bottom on the driver's side. So that's where I'll drain the coolant from. And so to get at that, I'm going to get underneath the car. I went ahead and put some cardboard down, because I know I'll need it. This cover right here is the first thing in our way. You're probably gonna have a lot more covers. This is all that's on this one right now. And it's got a couple of these plastic trim fasteners. One right here, and there's another one up there on the top of it. So I think it's really just those two that I need to take off to get this cover off. That's gonna make it a lot easier to get to the lower hose. So I'll go ahead and pop these off. To get this one off, I'm gonna use my least favorite tool in my toolbox, this trim fastener remover. So I'll try to get this in underneath this fastener and pop it out. There we go. I can replace this. I've got a kit of fasteners, so I don't necessarily need to save this one. And now I'll try to do the same with this one up top inside the wheel well. This would probably be a lot easier to record if I jack the car up, but I'm trying to avoid that. So I'll get this in here and pop this one out, and it helps if you can get underneath the head of the fastener. There we go. And that one should come out now. And if not, I can use this again and hopefully pop this out. There we go. So with that one removed and this one removed as well, this thing should come off. And it's not coming off because it's got a bolt right there too. So I have to take this bolt out. And this is a 12mm bolt. So I'll finish getting this out, and that's where it's going through right there. There we go. And with all that, this cover is loose. So I'll get that out of the way. Probably need to clean that up before I put it back on. And now we can get a lot better look under here. So there's the lower radiator hose. We'll disconnect that, drain the coolant, and then we can get the radiator out. These hose clamps look like an 8mm bolt on them, and they don't look like they're gonna be super easy to take off. I would like to put some better hose clamps on here. I may need to order some. And these are pretty badly rusted, so I'm really trying to get a good seat with my socket on these. I can't really tell if it's loosening it or not. Oh, yeah, it is. It's working. So before I go any further, I need to get my catch pan. I grabbed my small oil change catch pan. You may need a bigger one if your radiator's full. I know that this has just had water dumped into it every once in a while to keep something flowing through it. So I know it's not totally full, but I may regret not getting a bigger catch pan. But we're about to find out. So I'll get this clamp off far enough that I can put it back towards the hose. There we go. So I'll move this back, and then I can just pull this radiator hose off of here. Hopefully it's going to be as easy as that. All right, so I'll see how easily I can do this without getting coolant all over me. So it's pretty loose, which is good news. Sometimes these are seized on and they're hard to get off, but there's no good way to do this without getting coolant all over me, so I'm just going to go for it. There we go. So I'll let that drain out. That really wasn't too bad. So I'll let that finish draining, and then I'll get the radiator out. And while I wait for the coolant to finish draining out, I can take off this air intake. It's probably supposed to have two fasteners right here, but those are missing. So this just comes right out. This feeds into this air intake port. So I'll need to keep that in mind when I put this back in. And I can start working on this upper radiator hose. So this one's also got an 8mm bolt. And when I get these off, I suspect that I'm gonna have to look for some new radiator hoses. I don't like these pipe clamps. I would prefer some constant tension clamps. Those are a lot better for things like this. So I'll look at replacing those once I get all this off and I can measure these hoses a lot easier. So I can see how difficult this one's gonna be to take off. And this one's pretty loose too, which is good news. And while my catch pan's under there, I'll see if I can just go ahead and pop this off. There we go. All right, so we've got the upper hose off, the lower hose off, and all we have left are the fasteners holding on the radiator. So there's one here and one here. And then there are also electrical connectors for the fans down below, as well as two smaller ports for the lines on the bottom. So there is one of the hoses that we got to take off. That's all the way on the passenger side. And then there is one more right here on the driver's side. So I'll get some pliers and get those off. So for this one on the passenger side, I'm just going to use a set of pliers. And I'll just grab this clamp, open it up, and slide it down the hose. Once I get it far enough past the port, I can let go of it and then just pull this hose off of this connection. I use this to put it in here and push this hose off, and it actually works really well. So that got that hose off for me. Move my catch pan over, and I can leave that there to drip while I get the other one. And the other one is right up here underneath where the lower radiator hose was connected in. So this is the hose I just disconnected. The other clamp is right behind this hose, and it's a lot easier to move out of the way since I disconnected it first. So I'll just get this clamp off the same way, and I'll try this tool again. And that actually works really well. And with that one disconnected, I can let it drain, and then I'll work on getting off the fan electrical connectors. There is one right here, so I'll go ahead and disconnect this one while I'm here. I've got these electrical disconnect pliers. These are great. They're made by a brand called Lisle. So this one looks like it's just got a push tab there on the top, and so I'll grab it right there and see if I can just pull this off. And that is not moving, and so I'm not really sure that that's how it's connected. I think I might need to lift up on this tab to pull this out. Yep, that worked. So I lifted up on this tab here and pulled it out. And now that's disconnected, so we've got one more on the other side. And the electrical connector for the fan on the passenger side is pretty accessible right here, so I'm gonna go ahead and get this from here. I'll do the same thing. I'm gonna lift up on this tab, and hopefully this will just pull right out. There we go. Got that one out too. That wasn't too bad. So this fan connector is zip tied to the frame, so I'm gonna have to cut that zip tie before this will come off. Just get my cutters down in there and cut that zip tie. There we go. That probably would have been easier to do from the bottom, but that's okay. I got it off. So at this point, I think these two fasteners on the top is all that's holding the radiator in. So I'll go ahead and take these off. These are also 12mm fasteners. And it'll be a lot faster with my battery ratchet. And with those out, I think we've got everything out to take the radiator out. So it is definitely loose. I can lift these brackets up. And this radiator is loose. There's this plastic piece here that's just attached with one fastener. So I think if I take that off, it's gonna be easier to get this radiator out. It's just got one of these Phillips screw style fasteners. There we go, that wasn't too bad. I just used these and popped it out. And this has some clips on the bottom right here. And once I got one popped out, I can turn it a little bit and get that other one out. So that's what the clips look like. If you can pull down on those, you can get it freed up. And then this comes out. And with that out, I've got a lot more room to slide this radiator up. With that piece there, it looked like it was the fans were gonna hit this radiator hose, and I'm really trying to leave the fans on and take those off when I go to transport them onto the new radiator. And so now I can go ahead and pop these brackets off. And the last thing holding me up right in the middle, in between the two fans, down here is a zip tie on this line that is holding it to the fan. That line is connected over here, so I could remove the hose clamp here or just cut that zip tie that's right there. So that's what I'm gonna do. That zip tie is actually way easier to get to right here underneath. So I'll just get in here and cut this. This is gonna be easier to get out if I take off this hose clamp and get this upper radiator hose all the way off. So I'll go ahead and loosen this all the way because I'm gonna replace these anyway. And there's still one more hose connected down here. I'll show you where it's connected better once I get this out, but I think I can just pull it right off. Yep, that one just pulled right off right there. And with all that off now, this should just pull right out. There we go. And so there is the old one next to the new one. First thing that I notice is the way these ports on the bottom are positioned on the old one. So I'll need to match that on the new one. I'll take the fans off, put them on the new one, take off that coolant reservoir and put that on too. I'm gonna dump that out because I wanna put all new coolant in the system. But this shouldn't be too bad, it's just moving stuff over. One thing I thought was weird on this old one that I saw as I was looking at taking it out is it's got this port here and somebody just put basically a hose cap on it. The new one doesn't have that port, so I don't have that problem. I don't need to transfer that over, but I'm not sure why that old one's got that port there. There are two versions of this car. One is a turbocharged So I wonder if that has something to do with that. Possibly. I don't know too much about turbo, but the good news for me is that I don't have to mess with that. So I'll start with getting these fans off. It looks like there are just two 10mm bolts holding on each fan. One for the fan on this side is underneath the coolant overflow reservoir. So I'll go ahead and take that off. It's got a locking tab right here that if you just pull this down, you can get this reservoir out. And from there I can just pull it out of the base from the bottom. And then I'll pull this hose out of the top. I'm gonna leave the hose in the bottle and just disconnect it right here where the cap is. And then I can dump this coolant in my catch pan. With the overflow tank removed, we can see all 4 bolts for the fans. These are pretty rusted, so I'm gonna hit them with some PB Blaster. And I'll use a 10mm socket to take these off. And those loosened up easier than I thought, so I'm gonna finish them off with my battery ratchet. Those out, I can take the fans off and transfer them over to the new radiator. And I can also get a much better shot of the crack that was causing this radiator to leak. So that's a pretty big crack. It was leaking pretty bad, so we definitely needed a new radiator. And before I put the fans on the new radiator, I'd like to clean these up a little bit, since this is probably going to be the only time I'll ever have these off. To clean up these fans, I'm going to use some green cleaner and the brush from my dustpan. And that looks way better. And with the fans cleaned up and ready to go onto the new radiator, I want to make sure that this radiator matches the old one. So I'll just do a quick comparison, and the only difference that I see is a good difference. And that is that the new radiator is missing this extra port that was blocked off on the old one. So that's good news. The only thing that I need to do is reposition these bottom inlets right here. These are actually for oil cooler lines for the transmission fluid. If you're like me and you wonder why there's oil in your coolant, it's because the lines going into these bottom ports here are for transmission oil. So I will reposition those, get them to look just like these, and then I'll get these fans onto the new radiator and we'll get it installed. I generally am not a fan of adjustable crescent wrenches, but this is one situation where I think an adjustable crescent wrench is actually the right tool. So I'll position this similar to how it's positioned on the old radiator and just tighten this up. And I'll do the same with this one. And I think that looks pretty good. So with those repositioned, I'm ready to put the fans onto the new radiator. It's got these spots right here at the bottom where the bottom of the fan feeds into. And then it's got the 2 holes at the top for the screws. And so I'll just feed these into the bottom. They slide right in and then drop it down. And I'll do the same with this side. And next I can put the 4 screws back in the top of the fans. And I'll just slowly tighten them down with my battery ratchet. And I took the cap off the old radiator and I'll just transport it onto the new one. And I cleaned up the outside of the coolant overflow reservoir a little bit. So I'll get this in there. And I'll reattach this hose. It feels a little loose, so I may get a zip tie or something to hold this down. Best thing would be to get a small constant tension clamp and put that on here. So I may do that. I'm gonna get new clamps for the radiator hoses. So I'll make sure to get a set that's got a small one that'll fit onto this coolant reservoir overflow tube. And so now I've got everything onto the new radiator and it's ready to go back in. But before I put the new radiator in, I want to go ahead and change out this serpentine belt. It's right here. It's easy to get to. I can just take this cover off and change it out real quick. That was another part of this quote, that they were trying to charge $192 to do this. I got a new belt for like 17 bucks. I'll link this in the description too. It's a really good idea to go ahead and change this out while you got it open, save yourself a couple $100 and get a new belt. And I poured my coolant into this empty jug and I noticed there was a lot of oil in it. You'll definitely want to take your old coolant to a recycling facility or an auto parts store and they'll recycle it. And so I'll just add that to my stack of jugs that need to be recycled. And now I'm ready to take that cover off. It's just got one bolt here. It looks like a 10mm. And I've still got my 10mm socket on here from doing the fans. So I'll take that out and take this cover off. It's Cover's got a little piece that goes into this hole right here, so you can just pull that right off. And with all the pulleys exposed, this is a really good time to make a diagram of how the belt is orientated through all these pulleys. You can draw a picture, you can Google it, you can do whatever you need to make sure that you know how to put this back in. A couple of clues to help you out: the flat pulleys are always going to have the flat side of the belt touching them, and the pulleys with grooves on them are going to have the grooved side of the belt touching them. Now that's only going to get you so far, so you definitely want to make sure that you have some kind of diagram, or hopefully your memory is better than mine. So I can see some indication of why the serpentine belt was recommended to be replaced. We've got some small cracks right here. We've got some wear on the edge of the belt, and this is honestly just a really good time to do this. And just as I suspected, this tensioner pulley has a 14mm bolt head on it. So I'll get my 14mm socket and my long breaker bar, and so I'll just pull it this way and take this belt off of one of these pulleys, and then I can release it, and now I can just take the belt off the rest of the way. All right, there we go. Let's match it up to the new belt. And that doesn't match at all, so I'll have to get a new belt. And how about this one? Yeah, that looks better. I'll link this one in the description. I found this diagram for the belt routing, which is gonna help me to get this belt routed around these pulleys correctly. And so I'm gonna follow that. So I got it this far, and I just need to get the belt around the alternator here. And so I'll loosen the tension with the tensioner, and it may be easier to go around this big pulley. So I'll get it around the alternator, and it's easier to slide it over this pulley. So I'll get that on there, get it back around the tensioner, and make sure that it's centered on all the other pulleys. And everything feels good, so I'm gonna release this. And the orientation looks good, and also the tension feels good. So I think we're all right. And with the belt in place, I can put this cover back on. I've got this plastic fastener here that's attached to the cover. So I just want to line up the screw, push that fastener in, and then I can tighten this screw down. And that looks good, and we're done with the belt. And before I get the new radiator in, I just want to clean up down here. I noticed some coolant down here around the lower mount, so I just want to clean that up real quick before I get the new radiator in. And the last thing I'm going to do before putting the new radiator in is to replace the lower radiator hose. I'm going to replace the upper hose too, but I want to do the lower before I get the radiator in there because it'll be easier to get to. I'll have an explanation at the end of the video why I went with new hoses and clamps when I could have just reused the old ones. But for now, I'll just say these cheap pipe clamps are not the best, especially for coolant hoses. I like these constant tension clamps a lot better. And so I've just got one more clamp to take off back there. And so I'll get down here and just take this clamp off real quick. I got my catch pan underneath just in case. Guess I didn't need the catch pan. And so I put new clamps on the hose and moved them back a little bit so that I can fit this on and then move the clamp where it needs to be. So I'll fit the new hose on and push it on all the way. And then I'll wait to put the clamp on until I've got the radiator in there and make sure that this hose is going to mate up well. I may need to turn it a little bit, so I'll know that once I get the radiator in. And so now I'm ready to get the new radiator in. I've got the fans cleaned off. I want to take one last look at all the ports that I have. So there's a port down here for the lower radiator hose, port up here for the upper hose, a connection for each of the fans, and then these two oil cooler connections. And that's it. So the long tube routes through right here. It's got a bracket right here to hold it. So I need to put that one in there. It's going to route through to this port. The shorter hose goes into that port, and then the lower hose and the upper hose connections. So with that, I'm pretty good with what I need to get connected. I'll go ahead and get this in there and get those hoses connected. Alright, I got all the hoses connected. These ports have this area here where it's raised up, and you just want to make sure that the clamp is as close to that as you can get it, but not on top of it. And make sure that there's plenty of hose on this side of the clamp. And I also made sure that the tabs for the clamps are in a spot where I can access them easily. So I did use new clamps for the upper and lower radiator hoses. So this one's got new clamps as well. I reused the old clamps for these oil cooler lines. These looked a little more robust than the ones that I bought. So even though they're kind of rusted, I just went ahead and left those on. But everything's connected and into any kind of retention clips that they've got. There's really just this one for the long hose. And then it looks like the short hose fits into this clip that was on the back of the fan. But I think everything looks good. So the only thing I had to do that I really don't like doing is using one of these style hose clamps for this tube for the overflow reservoir. I don't have any clamps that are this small, and I did have some of these on hand, so I used this. This is okay because this hose doesn't get hot, but everything's attached. I got the mounts on, and so now I'm ready to put some coolant into the radiator. I'll show you the proper way to fill the coolant, but it starts with taking the cap off and filling this thing full. And so I'll start by putting a little bit of coolant in here and checking for leaks. Now that I've got the radiator full, I can see the coolant at the top here. I'm gonna go ahead and use my filler funnel to fill it the rest of the way. I probably should have started with that. I just grabbed this blue one because it was close. But I've got this kit that you use to fill the coolant all the way to the top. I've got the cap off, and it comes with a few different sized caps so you can find the one that fits onto your radiator. And I'll put a rubber gasket on here, and then put this cap with an opening on it on top of that gasket. But once you've got that on and it feels secure, you can put this coupler in here. And it should have a tight fit because of that gasket. It may actually be easier to stick this in first and then tighten this down, so that'll keep it in place. Alright, with that on secure and this has a tight fit, I can go ahead and attach the funnel. It just threads on right here. And once you get that tight, just make sure everything feels secure. And I'm going to close off this overflow tube. To do that, I'm just going to put a rag around it and attach some clamping pliers. Make sure that rag's not going to get in the fans or near the belt. And I can put some more coolant in the funnel. And now I'm ready to start the car and get it up to operating temperature. I'm going to hook up my scanner. This one's got a temperature gauge on it. And with that plugged into the port underneath the steering wheel, I can go down to engine coolant temperature. And then I'll start the car and measure the temperature from there. No leaks. So I'll let it get up to operating temperature. It should pull some of that coolant into the radiator once the thermostat opens up, and it should do that around 190 to 200 degrees. So you can rev the engine up a little bit, get it up to 2,000 RPM, and just kind of hold it there, and that'll help it heat up quicker. And what we'll see is this will keep climbing, and then at some point it's going to drop back down. That'll tell us that the thermostat opened up. And you'll see some bubbles coming up here. That's good. That's getting air out of the system. You want to look for that to stop by the time the thermostat opens up a couple of times. At the end, we'll make sure there's no more bubbles coming up. So I'm almost up to operating temperature. I see some bubbles coming up in the coolant, which is good. We're getting close. Still got the RPMs at about 2,000. Still got plenty of coolant in the funnel. And pretty soon we'll see this drop. And there the temperature started dropping, so that means the thermostat opened up. And so now we're at operating temperature. I want to watch for the thermostat to open up one more time. So we'll see another slight drop. I'm still seeing some bubbles coming out of the coolant. So we'll look for this thermostat to open up one more time, have the temperature drop down, and make sure that there's no more bubbles coming out of the coolant. Alright, I just saw quite a few more bubbles and it looks like the temperature's dropping again, so that's good. That's the second time the thermostat opened up. And the temperature dropped down to about 196 before it started jumping back up again. I don't see any more bubbles coming out, so I think we have bled all the air out of the system. And so I think we filled the coolant properly. So at this point the coolant is full and I can go ahead and shut the car off and get this funnel off of here. I'm just making sure that there are no bubbles now that I've let the thermostat open and close twice. So everything looks good. And so now I can go ahead and shut the car off. And I'm going to let this coolant cool off a little bit before I try to handle it. And now I can close this valve on the funnel. I can pull this out slowly. And I can put the rest of this coolant back into the jug. I can take my pliers off, make sure I didn't damage this tube. Looks like it's still in good shape. And be careful because this might be hot. And I can take this cap off, make sure I don't forget my gasket. And then I'll put the radiator cap back on. And with the cap back on, we know that the system is full. We bled all the air out of it. We saw that the thermostat opened and closed correctly. And the best news of all is we don't have any leaks. I can go ahead and put this cover back on. It snaps into place. And then I can put this fastener back in. Next, I can put the air intake back on. It slides into the filter housing over here. And then it's got these two spots right here for fasteners. I'm gonna put new fasteners in here. I've got this kit of assorted fasteners. I'll link this in the description. But I just need to find some that fit in here. That one feels pretty good. So I'll go ahead and use those. And I honestly don't remember ever using these fasteners, so I'm glad to use some that have been sitting in here since I got it. I've used this kit on quite a few projects. So this is cheap, it's like 20 bucks, and it has paid for itself in spades as many times as I've used fasteners. Those feel pretty good, so I think we're good there. And the last thing I have is this cover that I took off. I'll get the top of it fastened up here behind the wheel. And underneath, this one's got a screw that goes into a hole underneath the front. And I think it's safe to say that there were more covers on this car, but somebody has taken them off and thrown them away. I am a fan of that, by the way. I will put this back on because it's not my car, but if you want to throw these covers away, go for it. And there we go. All the covers back on and everything is good to go. So with that, everything looks good. I've got some cleaning up to do, but that was a success. Really wasn't too bad changing that radiator out. And before I end this, I want to talk a little bit about these constant tension hose clamps and the reason why I don't like these style hose clamps. So these don't allow for expanding and contracting of the hoses. And that's going to happen when you have coolant that's changing temperature. And so normally you'll put this on, you'll tighten it all the way down, and then as it gets hot, it tries to expand the hoses, and it can't because this is only one size. So these are better because they will expand with the tube as it heats up, and you'll get less warping and your hoses will last longer. So these will work just fine if you have to use them. This is kind of a better if. And when I looked at these tubes, I knew I at least wanted to replace these hose clamps. I figured while I was going to replace them, I might as well use what's even better. And I couldn't just use these onto these old hoses because they've got these marks where the old hose clamps were. And so if I tried to put these constant tension clamps here where these old clamps were, I ran the risk of causing a coolant leak. And at that point, I'd have to buy even more coolant. I may have to replace the hoses anyway. So I just went ahead and did it all. It was quite a bit. It was about 60 bucks for both the upper and the lower hose and these clamps here. I also bought some smaller clamps for the oil lines that go in the bottom of the radiator. I didn't end up using those because the ones that were on there were actually a lot better quality. They were a little rusted, but I decided to reuse those because the ones that I bought were not as good a quality. So all that to say, it's up to you what you want to do. I went ahead and replaced the hoses and the clamps because it's the right thing to do and this isn't my car. If you want to save some money, you could try to reuse your hoses. You could even try to reuse your clamps. If you're going to do that, I would at least suggest getting new clamps that are this same style. You can get them positioned in the same place that the old ones were, and then you don't have rusty clamps holding your hoses together. I probably could have done that, but like I said, this isn't my car, so I wanted to do it right. And now we know we've got new hoses, new clamps, and they should last a lot longer. This coolant filling funnel kit is pretty cool, but it's a little difficult to use. I could probably do another video on how to use that. I ran through it real quick in this video. It should get you by if you need to do that and you want to do it properly. I'll link that in the description. I did use 2 jugs of coolant, so you really only need 2 to get this job done. And really not even that many tools, considering I just changed out a whole radiator. So next, I'm going to do the front driver's side axle on this before I give it back to my parents. And this one really wasn't too bad. So thanks as always for watching, guys. I appreciate it. Subscribe if you want to see more content on this Forester. I may be doing more work in the future on it. And I will catch you guys in the next video.